All right, so today we're going to talk about the Great Depression. Um, I, I kind of make a joke here in saying that America turns into a bunch of bums here on the front page, but I think in before we start, I really want to make sure that you know um, sort of the severity of when we talk about a Great Depression, how serious an effect this had on the United States. Because if we go back to the last unit and we kind of recap um, the changes in the 20s, basically all of the changes that are going to happen in the 20s essentially are going to get put on pause for roughly 15 years because give or take, because in some ways like it with the Great Depression in World War II, a lot of these changes will America will just kind of slide into this horrible uh, economic period where families are breaking up, people become sort of migrant people across the country looking for jobs, and people really are struggling, and the effects that it has, and we're going to talk a lot about those today, but the effects that it has really are substantial. Um, and so, it's this really sort of serious part in American history that has a lot of long-term effects. It would be interesting to talk to some of maybe your grandparents would probably, depending on how old they are, maybe have some recollections of this time period from when they were little. All right, let's keep going. So long-term cause of the Great Depression. If you look at this, it just kind of go down the list here. Um, the first is that a number of key industries that had been critical during the 20s will either, you know, weaken near the end of the 20s or were already weak at the point at which the Great Depression started, as is the case with like farming. But with like the railroads and automobiles, and especially automobiles, remember we talked about the automobiles being the big sort of driver of economic growth in the 1920s. When the automobiles start to really cool down, um, uh, that really is one of these sort of key sort of causes of the Great Depression in the long term. Over the 1920s, you'll see like with number two is the overproduction of goods. So you start to see that the sort of combination between consumer spending starting to slow because of sort of the industry slowing down and people uh, sort of their real incomes dropping. Um, Markets become saturated with products, which and this is not the best example, but um, it's sort of this combination between people spending less money, um, in one because of sort of the economy as a whole slowing down, but also because just with overproduction of goods. Like I have this example here of you don't need two refrigerators, and because there's so many new consumer goods during the 1920s that develop, um, in many ways, like the consumption patterns for those large goods during the 1920s was at an unsustainable level because they were so new to the market. Um, and so, what's going to happen then is that these markets become saturated with these products. The warehouses are going to sit full. Companies start to lose money, and that has the effect of laying off workers. And so, like these key weak industries, the sort of economic weaknesses spread into other industries, and this sort of laying off of workers is going to have a greater impact even on the sort of economy as a whole, as those effects start to sort of spread throughout. Third, they have an uneven distribution of wealth and income. So most of the increases in income, uh, were on sort of evenly experienced by the American public during the 1920s. We talked about this in the last PowerPoint that roughly 40% of the country was living in poverty, um, and by the 1920s, these uh, sort of the growth in wages that happens basically after World War One. Um, that these the growth in wages hadn't kept up with inflation throughout the 1920s, and so by the end of the 1920s, um, these what would have been great wages, 10 years previously, weren't as great considering the changes in inflation throughout that period, and so that becomes problematic for and that's part of this, like, consumer spending slowing as well and consumption slowing. Um, Four, you have an unstable banking system. Um, you have a lot of deregulation that happens in the 1920s, which is going to lead to stock speculation by financial industries, which we'll talk about sort of briefly in the coming slides, about how this unstable banking system, they do sort of through for a while they get away with it, sort of mismanagement and taking risks with people's money, and it's eventually going to catch up to them, and that's going to be one of the biggest causes of the as far as, like, when you look at things and you say, well, why is this like the Great Depression, and why is it such a sort of fiasco that it is, and such a sort of prolonged sort of economic period of hardship? A lot of that has to do with the bank failures and the massive amount of wealth um, that is lost in America with the bank failures. And then one of the others, you just see the weak international economy. We talked about this in the last PowerPoint with, like, how Europe never really recovers from World War One, and how um, you know that when America starts to experience troubles, Europe very sort of quickly, Europe doesn't. So this sort of something that I need to be, I guess, can't generalize. Places like Germany do experience very sort of rough hardships. What's interesting, though, is, like, the Great Depression's not as bad in places like Britain or France, for example. We'll talk about the Hawley-Smoot tariff later on and how that's a not very wise decision made by President Hoover. But that just makes this sort of international economic situation worse, not better. So if we get to this, and I want to make sort of stop before this, we get into this too much, because this is a common misconception. The stock market crash in 1929 is not a cause of the Great Depression. Okay, so and I'm gonna kind of look. You can kind of look at this. I'm gonna go back really quick, but if you look at this chart here, um, it's the bottoming out of the stock market that happens, roughly over the course of, maybe a year and a half, give or take. Um, that really is the problem here. And then the massive amount of bank failures. So then these two things kind of go hand in hand, because of all the money that's lost with the bank failures. But I really wanted you to sort of recognize is that it's it's the it's this when the stock market crashes. Obviously, this is a big deal because of the sort of the financial problems that it's going to cause banks because of the run on banks, and like, this sort of economic stuff is going. I couldn't go into enough detail about this to really give you a great answer, so I'm just giving you a short, crappy answer. Um, but throughout the 1920s, this sort of bull market where the stock market continues to go up and up and up, by the point that, I mean, you can see from 1924 to 1929, it more than doubles in 5 years. And so that's a tremendous amount of growth. And so what happens is that not only are people and investors in an individual way buying stocks on margin, or essentially buying stocks with credit with money that they didn't have, but a lot of financial institutions were starting to do that as well, and they were starting to also buy stocks with money, like with people's money. So the bank holdings were being used to sort of purchase stocks and hopefully make profits. Now that's a great thing, and while the stock market's going up. Now the problem is when the stock market dips and never fully recovers, even though it does recover, I would say it recovers about. It's like I think I don't know if you look at it. It in the last couple months before it drops. Um, it gains like 100 points, but then it drops down 200 points, and I don't know. That's too much detail. Just understand that. I mean, it's way too simple-minded to say, well, the stock market crash happened, and then the Great Depression happened. It's more complex than that. I mean, and this is what I was trying to say to you is like it recovers a lot of it sort of like like you see that last like jump up before the crash and the sort of 6 months leading up to that. But it recovers a great chunk of that. The problem is that this sort of bottoming out, and then this is when this bottoming out starts happening, is at the same time that you start to see people really, what was called like the bank runs, and people, I don't know if you've ever seen, it's it's A Great Life or whatever the older Christmas movie is, where they at the very beginning they have It's a Wonderful Life. Um, they uh, they have a run on a bank and they show like what that looked like, and people basically would get there would people would get word that the bank was going under, and everyone would rush to the bank to see if their money was safe, and they'd start pulling their money out, and when everyone pulled their money out at the same time, the bank couldn't handle it, and then so as these are starting to happen, and they spread throughout the United States like wildfire, and the stock market just never recovers and continues to dip and dip and dip, to the point where it's 10% of what it was. It's a 90% dip from give or take, from where it was at its height. Um, you have enormous financial distress on the financial sector in America, which I mean hurts everything and has an effect on everything. And I think that we've sort of seen this most recently, like when the financial crisis, 10 years ago now. Uh, um, but we sort of look at this. By 1932, 6,000 banks had fallen. That's roughly a quarter of all banks had failed in America at that point. And what's really important to note and why bank failures had such an important effect at that time was that there's no insurance for your deposits. So like today, if you go and you put your money in a bank, there's something called the FDIC, which is um, the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, or I think corporation, and um, this group will insure your money in a bank up to $250,000. So essentially, like the government is insuring your money in a bank. And the FDIC gets created during the Great Depression. So before this, when all these banks are failing, if you had all your money that you had earned up during the 1920s and you'd saved it in a bank, if your bank failed, like your money was gone and there was no way to get your money back. So like if your bank failed, you're sort of just like SOL, like you're screwed. And you can kind of see like this point being made in this cartoon here, where he's talking to a squirrel, and so maybe they're making a joke there too. But why didn't you save some money for the future when times were good? And he said, I did. And then there's that little note there that says the victim of the bank failure. And this happens to sort of an untold number of people across the country. Um, and so to buy the sort of depth of the Great Depression, it's almost half of the banks in America fail. And I heard some like ridiculous stat that it was, I want to say it was like, there was like 30 states or something crazy didn't even have a bank at all that was operating in their state. There's some crazy statistic like that. Um, if we continue sort of down like these causes as we get into this, and sort of tied into this, you're also going to see a huge number of businesses start to fail. So as people lose money and they don't, consumer spending slows, and so and so and you have to understand this is all sort of like a big snowball thing. Is like when spending started to slow down because people were losing jobs, or they lost their money in the financial crisis, or say a bank failed or whatever, um, that when people stop spending money for whatever reason, business would start to lose money, and then they would have to lay off people, which meant that less people were spending money, which means that businesses were making less money, which means they had to lay off more people. So that snowball starts to happen where it's just like, the negatives contribute to more negatives and so on. And so these, by the time that we get to 1932, there's going to be enormous unemployment rates. Roughly one quarter of 1 in 4 people were unemployed. And if you include farmers, that number was probably roughly around 35%. And that's a huge number of people. Even at the worst sort of points of the sort of Great Recession that we went through most recently, it was never even close to that. If we look at total wages during this period, they're going to be basically cut in half. And like I was saying, like this is really important because when there's lower wages, it means people are making less money, businesses are making less, more layoffs. Which when there's more layoffs, there's less money to spend, and like I said, that sort of process keeps going. I think it's interesting here. I sort of found this picture of this free coffee and donut line from Chicago, and it was actually established by Al Capone, and just sort of tie that back to what we were talking about in the 20s with the rise of organized crime as they're selling illegal liquor, because liquor is still illegal right now. Now, when FDR gets elected in 1932, he's going to change that. But at this point, the 18th Amendment is still in place, and liquor is illegal. If we look at some of the psychological stuff, Americans are really going to experience a huge loss of self-worth, and like this is one of the most important sort of effects that gets rarely talked about, is that the divorce rate jumps considerably. Marriage and birth rates were the lowest in history. People can't afford to get married or have kids. It has a huge psychological effect on this sort of idea that like America is, the manifest destiny thing, that God had chosen America to be this, this mighty nation, and that we were destined people. It really sort of shakes that core belief of Americans. People, you can look at this and look at like that, these little shanty towns pop up all over in American cities because their houses get foreclosed on because they can't pay their mortgages, and they call them Hoovervilles. And you can see a picture of this on the right. Kind of funny. They also people started this sort of trend where they would walk around with their pockets pulled out, and they used to call those Hoover flags. You'd walk around with your pockets out to signify to people that you didn't have any money or you didn't have anything, so don't like ask to for any change. They called those Hoover flags. So like, and I hadn't mentioned this yet, but President Hoover, and we talked about him in the last PowerPoint in the 1920s. He's the president during this time, and obviously we talked about sort of like the string of Republican presidents during the 1920s and the immense amount of economic growth during the 20s. But Hoover's response is really interesting to me because Hoover is going to react to the Great Depression very slowly, and the reason that he felt that the economy, and this is just sort of like one of those things with capitalism, is like if you study capitalism, it has this sort of natural ups and downs. Unregulated capitalism is going to go through ups and downs and sort of take the roller coaster. And so when Hoover kind of misunderstood the severity of the sort of economic problem that and the sort of the how severe the combination of these different factors was going to be. And so he's slow to develop it. And once he starts to get a feel like, oh, this is something really serious, Hoover wanted private businesses to lead the recovery. He didn't want the government to be sort of responsible for being the ones to sort of lead this recovery movement. And he he, and this is maybe in some ways this, like he, this, it's modern Republican economic thought right now too. Is like that people, most Republicans believe that like that the government shouldn't directly help people during hard economic times, whether that be welfare or whatever. Um, when Hoover did start using the government to try to make changes, Hoover started to put money into businesses and hoping that like the money that the government was filtering into business would filter through the economy of the American people. And um, this the problem with this is like just at the time when like it's too little and it's too late, and he's also like trying to combat the very worst of the sort of deepening of the depression. Once he starts going, it's he's trying to take action while the economy is sort of taking its sort of biggest falls. Um, and so like he does do something, and so by the end of his presidency, especially as we move towards the 1932 presidential election, he does try, like for example, like the best example of like Hoover starting to um, use government is you can look at like the creation of the Hoover Dam, um, and the Congress spent almost $1 billion on public works leading up to this 1932 election. But like I said, it's a little bit too late. It's too little, too late. And so, but what's interesting to me is that so when we look at like the government regulating surplus crops and regulating prices for agriculture, government spending money for public works to give people jobs and put people to work, and then when we look at this sort of Reconstruction Finance Corporation, government loaning money to large corporations, the states stimulating the economy, that those are in most cases a lot of what FDR ends up doing in his New Deal, and we'll talk about that later. It's just that like Hoover obviously was, even though it wasn't Hoover's fault, Hoover gets blamed for the Depression. Hoover also makes a number of very stupid mistakes leading up to the 1932 election. So like he's going to sign the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which raised tariff rates in America to over 60%, which was an attempt to help protect U.S. businesses. But what ends up happening is European countries do the same, and global trade is going to drop by roughly 40%, and that's going to make the Depression worse. Hoover is also going to veto the use of government money for relief for the needy. So like basically Congress tried to create a welfare program for struggling Americas, and Hoover vetoed that. Obviously not a very smart move in the context of the situation, especially when you're trying to get reelected. We're talking about a quarter of the people in America don't have jobs, and certainly everyone was struggling in some way. And then the sort of last fiasco that sort of is the sort of cherry on top is that during World War I or after World War I, U.S. troops and World War I veterans were promised bonus checks for their service. And I think the term on the bonus checks was like 25 years or 20 years or something like that. And so what ends up happening during the Great Depression is that these troops, these World War I veterans, started to go to Washington, D.C. to protest to get their World War I bonus checks that they were promised. They just wanted them earlier. They say, hey, look, like, and I think they had a reasonable point. They said, like, hey, look, we're in this really bad sort of economic scenario. We have these checks that have been promised to us. If we could just get them, 10 years, 15 years early, obviously it would help us a great deal, and it could help the economy. And so they're protesting, and what ends up happening is there's so many veterans coming. They created these camps outside of D.C. And Hoover had current U.S. troops go and basically they were going to force them out of their camps, and it turns violent. And I mean, obviously Hoover didn't tell these guys to go and shoot at World War I veterans, but that's essentially what happens. Is they like burn the camp down. There ends up being shooting back and forth. I think they actually kill some World War One veterans. You'd have to check that. Um, but just crazy stuff. It gets put all over the newspapers, and that's sort of like the end of the end for Hoover. Um, so if we look at 1932 election, I'm going to go back to this in a second. But if you look at the 1932 election, just sort of cap this off. Um, you know, Hoover gets smoked in this election. Uh, and so FDR is going to win in a landslide there. Um, and FDR is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was the sort of Democratic governor of New York at the time, distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, who we talked about a couple lectures ago. And what FDR gets elected doing is promising a New Deal, which is what we're going to sort of transition into talking about here in a second. I'm going to jump back to this real quick, though, okay? So when we look at this, what I want to talk about before we get into the New Deal and stuff, because this is going to connect what we're going to talk about tomorrow, is that this global depression is going to sort of plant the seeds for World War II. Hitler is going to come to power in Germany, sort of promising to rebuild Germany and sort of bring Germany out of the sort of the hole that the Great Depression had sort of plunged Germany into. Because remember, German economic growth in the latter part of the 20s was almost solely dependent on American financing and American loans. Remember we talked about the American plan to loan Germany money so that the Germans could pay the reparations payments back to France and Britain, so that France and Britain could pay the money back that they owed America, and so on. So when the American financial institutions collapse, the sort of German recovery collapses, and Hitler comes to power, sort of promising to fix those problems. And then also the Japanese are choosing to fight the Great Depression by expanding their military and imperializing China during this time. And so, it's these two countries that are really the aggressive nations, other than Italy, and we'll talk about Italy next in the lecture in World War II, is that these two countries really are going to be the aggressors when it comes to starting World War II. All right, so we look at the New Deal. What's interesting is they actually, in this election, they passed the 20th Amendment, which moved the inauguration date from what it used to be in March to January, because originally when they did the whole inauguration thing, they'd have the elections on the first Tuesday after a Monday in November, and because back in the 1700s, it took people a long time to get from point A to point B. Before there were railroads, and so it gave them a long time to get from wherever they needed to go to Washington, and so the 20th Amendment got rid of that. So it moved, because there used to be once you got elected you had to wait till March to start being president and getting policies enacted and getting moving. Because the Depression was so bad, they said, well, let's move this up so that FDR can basically get to work. And so they passed two amendments right away. Passed the 20th Amendment, like I said, gets rid of this sort of lame duck period. And so now you get elected in November, you get inaugurated in January. And then the 21st Amendment was the repeal of Prohibition. So when they passed the 21st Amendment, that it got rid of the 18th Amendment and finally legalized liquor again. Which is easy to remember, because remember, you can't drink when you're 18, so 18th Amendment took away booze. 21st Amendment, you can drink when you're 20. Now, those ages aren't related to that. It's just an easy sort of trick to remember that. All right, so let's talk about the New Deal. FDR sort of slogan was FDR. It's for a New Deal. And he sort of promised to give Americans a New Deal. And what this was is that FDR he's campaigned that he was going to use the government to help the people, and help the country recover. So I think in some ways it's interesting to think about FDR maybe as like this like quasi-progressive, maybe. I don't know. I think that's something I'm going to have you do in classes, is sort of think about the extent to maybe like how these reforms would fit in the context of like a second progressive era. Um, but I think like this is really important just to understand that like FDR changes the way that the government cares for the people, and that like that from the New Deal moving forward is that the government really is going to um, sort of create a safety net for people, that like the government is going to be there to provide sort of basic things for people, so that no one struggles too much. Um, and in order to do this, what's going to be a really important change is that like the government's going to really need to grow considerably to do this. So, it's just something to think about. Um, all right, so if we look at sort of the purposes of the New Deal, um, there were three like main purposes: relief, sort of give people relief from the sort of effects of the Great Depression, recovery. So you wanted to get the economy back on track, and then reform. He wanted to like reform the sort of American capitalism so that this didn't happen again. And the overall objective, and I think like this gets sort of overblown, is like people talk about FDR being a socialist and all this sort of crap, is that like FDR really wanted to save capitalism in America. And you can sort of look at like this New Deal as a way in which uh, you know I wish I would have taught you world history, because in many ways this is sort of I like to like make this comparison. In many ways, this is like Bismarck's policies. Bismarck, who was uh, the German leader in the 1870s and 80s. He sort of used the communist and socialist policies against them, and I think in some ways like there's some similarities, and obviously there's differences, and there's important differences, but I think there's some similarities here, is like where you incorporate some of these policies of the socialist parties and communist parties in what they were wanting in Americans, and try to sort of incorporate what they want so that you don't get a full-scale revolution, political revolution, because of the sort of economic distress. Um, if we look at FDR's first 100 days, we see an unprecedented passage of legislation that we've never seen. I mean, there's whole books written about FDR's first 100 days as president. Um, they passed unemployment insurance, Social Security, minimum wage. They passed a whole bunch of acts that resulted in conservation in creation of national parks. They put restrictions on child labor, and really, I mean, that sounds nice, but really it was for economic reasons. If kids have to go to school, then that means there's more jobs for men to get. And what we see is that like this 100 days, I mean, they do an enormous amount of legislating here to try to get the government acting on behalf of the people. The sort of big initial problem that they go after is banking. Okay, and so what they do is, I mean, it's like relief, recovery, reform. Like they try to immediately sort of relieve the situation. So FDR is going to declare a national bank holiday for 5 days. What that meant is this bank holiday shut down all of the banks that were still open in the country. And what they did is they had 5 days these banks did to prove that they were financially sound, and only if they could prove that they were financially sound could they reopen. And so these banks had this period to sort of get their act together. And on the night before the banks were set to reopen, FDR delivered his first fireside chat, which he'll become famous for these things. Is that he would give these weekly addresses to the people, and they became known as fireside chats because people would sit around the radio next to a fire and listen to their president talk to them. And what this first one is so important is because FDR gets on the radio, um, and he basically tells Americans, he's like, look, we've shut down the banks for 5 days. All of the banks that are going to be reopening tomorrow, we've gone through, we've checked their books, they're financially sound. You have nothing to worry about. In fact, when we do reopen the banks tomorrow, if people do panic and you go down to your banks and you start pulling money out, and there's a run on banks tomorrow, like this is essentially going to dig us deeper into the hole. And so he says, look, you have to trust me, you have to trust the government. We've checked this. You've got to trust us on this. It's what's best for everyone. And what's great is, 35 million Americans listened to that first fireside chat. And when they reopened the banks, is that from that point on, deposits are going to outpace withdrawals in banks. And so, it sort of shows sort of Americans' trust of FDR, and that's going to be really important sort of moving forward. They also passed an act that was supposed to reform the system, so it created the FDI, this Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, which created the FDIC. We remember the FDIC insures your money in banks. What's interesting about Glass-Steagall, let me look at this. Is that when it was, I think in the 1990s. Sorry, I just kind of was thinking there. I think it was in the 1990s. They actually, I think it was Clinton, like 1999, but basically the Glass-Steagall Act put a bunch of, it wasn't just the FDIC. Like Glass-Steagall Bank Reform Act did a bunch of different things that put a bunch of like limits on what banks could and couldn't do, and they removed it, I think, in the late 1990s. And then it's a lot of people say that, like, when we revoked the Glass-Steagall Act in the 1990s, that's what caused, was a big cause of the financial crisis that comes in 2007, 2008. It's so. I think that it would be wrong to not point out to you, and would be, thinking about our future, to point out to you, if you haven't already sort of connected the dots, is like when banks and financial industries are deregulated, there's a very sort of close tie when that happens to huge economic crises. Happens in 1920s, happens in the 1980s. Most people don't, especially because you guys are way too young for this. But there was a huge financial crisis in the 1980s where a bunch of banks failed then too. A lot of the same things as far as sort of deregulating financial sectors, was present there. And then obviously in 2007, 2008. All right, so we look at some of these other sort of acts of like what I'll call like the first New Deal. There's no technical first and second New Deal. It's all like one big New Deal. It's just sometimes easier to separate these into like the first wave of New Deal legislations and like the second wave of New Deal legislation. So that's what's going on here. So if we look at these, just run down the list. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, basically just government regulation of the stock market. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, basically put young men to work in national parks. And I think one of the other things you need to recognize about this, so like this is a public good. So they planted trees, they built dams and flood controls in these parks. They drained swamps, they built trails, they did all this good stuff in these national parks to make them more enjoyable for the public. But it's also an interesting thing to think about is like, well, why were they trying to send all these young men um, out into these parks to live for long periods of time? Well, when you think about it, you know, the biggest sort of problem group that you could think about in cities, you know, is if you had a bunch of young men that didn't have jobs and nothing to do, is that, you know, they could be easily persuaded into um, you know, sort of radicalized groups. So I think like you should understand like there's some social control elements happening there. Um, they also passed the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which is basically like the U.S. national government gave money to states for unemployment. Um, and then they also, the Civil Works Administration, CWA, they created 4 million jobs. And you think about it, this was like a emergency plan to give people jobs. I mean, like they paid people to sweep streets and rake leaves and things like that. And this is terminated in 1934 once other economic programs start getting going, sort of like the Public Works Administration, which was a bigger program and gave money to states to provide jobs to build schools, dams, government buildings, sewage systems, highways, basically any public project. But the problem is that these plans took time to develop, and so that's why this sort of paired nicely with the CWAs, because those things were like, all right, here's money, just pay people to do things, and then here's more money, so start planning for big projects to put more money, more people to work. Um, and then, so this PWA is the first one. They actually passed the Works Progress Administration, was the WPA in 1935 during sort of the second New Deal, that will strengthen this and sort of build on this. They also passed the Agricultural Adjustment Administration or create the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, but the Supreme Court's going to rule that unconstitutional. This was basically government help for farmers. So they paid government, basically paid farmers to farm less. But this, so two things. One, the Supreme Court says, well, national government doesn't constitutionally have the power to do this. Second, it was actually widely criticized during the time because even though it helped farmers, it really screwed over a bunch of people that relied, like didn't grow their own food, and because food prices went up when people were already hungry and people were struggling, so they had less money to buy food. You also had the Federal Farm Loan Act, gave money to pay mortgages. There wasn't a good time to kind of fit this in, so I put this here. The reason that the government really is trying to help farmers, because the farmers, remember, had struggled even during the 1920s. But what gets worse is that in the late 20s and throughout the 30s is that there's a severe drought that affects the Great Plains, sort of like the breadbasket of America. This what was once very fertile land. There's this horrible drought. And millions of people actually end up leaving this. You can see this picture down here on the bottom right. Is that the drought gets so bad there was actually like dust blizzards that would affect the entire nation. There's stories about how they would get these dust blizzards that would sort of spin up in the Great Plains, and they would deposit inches of dirt onto like places like Chicago and all the way as far as like there were dust blizzards that would carry all the way across the country to like New York and Boston. So just think about like and when we talk about like farmers and farmers struggling and why the government was concerned about this is part of the reason. Some of the other first New Deal programs is the National Industrial Recovery Administration. This is probably the most interesting and far-reaching New Deal program because what it was essentially designed to do was the government would kind of in some ways manipulate the economy to help it recover, so it like was designed to prevent extreme competition between companies, so that they would start to charge appropriate prices for things. They start making money and hiring more people. It also was meant to fix labor and management disputes. They set max work hours for workers. They set a minimum wage. They set a minimum price for goods and production limits. So again, it's like in some ways it's in some ways, it's honestly, it's like, that's some parts of like communism where it's like, the government saying is like, you have to charge workers this, you have to charge this price for this good, and you can only produce this much. But the reason they're trying to do that is they're trying to sort of like make a hard reset in the economy. Um, Ultimately, this is ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says this is like a gross sort of overstepping of sort of constitutional limits of what the government can and can't do. So they get rid of it. Now, FTR will come back and put some elements of this back into, another New Deal program, which we'll talk about here in a second. Just sort of note that the Supreme Court here is as Congress and the President are trying to create a sort of series of legislation that is designed to sort of get America out of this hole. The Supreme Court's kind of getting in the way, and that's what it's designed to do. So I mean, it's doing its job, but this is going to become an issue here, and that's why I kind of bring that up. They also passed the TVA, which all of you know what the TVA is. We building hydroelectric dams in southeast, and then the FHA, which is interesting because they're still giving out FHA loans today. It's Federal Housing Authority. Some of you may buy your first homes on FHA loans, which just give you you can get a smaller down payment. So it's they wanted Americans to start to buy homes again. So they were trying to make home mortgages more accessible to people that didn't have lots of money. If we look at sort of the overall effects of this sort of first wave of New Deal, again, like I say, first New Deal, it's really like the first wave of New Deal legislation. The economy is going to improve, but it didn't come anywhere close to fully recovering. Salary and wages are going to increase by roughly 50%. Farm incomes are going to double. Unemployment's going to drop, but still really high at 20%. And so, it's undoubtedly gotten better. But like I said, it's nowhere close to where it was before the sort of Great Depression had set in. So what ends up happening is that they, in 1935, 36, and especially as this second election is, so FDR is going to be up for re-election in 1936, is that the government sort of gets back to it and tries to sort of institute this new wave of legislation. So you look at this and you probably like the biggest one of these is the Works Progress Administration, which at one point employed 40% of the nation's workers. When you think of that, almost half of the workers in America were employed by the government, which is crazy. And then this is like all this sort of like buildings, government buildings, bridges, roads, airports, schools, hospitals, everything. A good example of this WPA project in Jackson is actually the old school that's like across the street from Millsaps. It's like that big concrete building on State Street. Is a good example of like a WPA building that was built with WPA money. We were really getting into American history to talk about like WPA architecture and things like that, but we will sort of let that go. If you look at the Rural Electrification Administration, so remember just talking about the 1920s about how there was still a significant chunk of rural Americans who didn't have access to electricity, so the REA changes that. They also passed the Wagner Act, which is perhaps one of the more important pieces of legislation in U.S. history, because what it did is this asserted the right of labor to unionize and, importantly, bargain collectively. So this has come up over and over and over again in American economic history, with this sort of conflict between workers and businesses, and this very sort of controversial thing of workers having the ability to bargain collectively, which just means that, like, workers can negotiate their salaries and can negotiate contracts as a big group instead of being forced to negotiate as individuals, because oftentimes you get better treatment, you get better outcomes when you negotiate as a whole group. If you look at the Fair Labor Standards Act, it did a lot of the stuff that was declared unconstitutional, and the sort of first wave of legislation. We'll talk about like why this ends up getting through the second time here in a second. But it did minimum wage, 40-hour work week, prohibited child labor. They also passed the Social Security Act, which basically just like gives money to retired Americans. And for you that don't know, like Social Security, so like all of you have Social Security numbers, it's essentially like a bank account number. Is that, on every check that you're going to earn for your life, you're going to pay money into Social Security. And then when you retire, you essentially get portions of that money back. And so it's basically like government's forcing you to save for retirement. At that time, it was good because many people that were struggling to, especially retired people that were struggling to be able to find jobs because they're old, and everyone was struggling to find jobs, and gave people money to go spend and support themselves. The Revenue Act of 1935 is really important, so FDR had to fund all these New Deal programs, so like he reverses all of the tax cuts during the 20s, and income taxes on wealthiest Americans during this time period go way up. So if you look at election 1936, really all you need to see, FDR dominates this election. All right, so I sort of alluded to this earlier, but what happens again in that sort of first wave of New Deal programs is that the Supreme Court was ruling a lot of this legislation unconstitutional. And what FDR did is he submits this sort of court packing plan, which he wanted to like reorganize the Supreme Court. What he wanted to do is he wanted to add 6 members and also remove judges that were older than 70. And essentially what he wanted to do is get more guys on the Supreme Court that would support his legislation. And it doesn't pass, but what's interesting is that even though it doesn't pass, like Congress doesn't go along with this, that the Supreme Court really, after the first sort of wave of New Deal legislation, really stops ruling these New Deal legislation unconstitutional. All right, so what's going to happen in 1937 is that FDR is going to burn a lot of bridges trying to get the court packing plan through, and it doesn't work, and so that like sort of strains the relationship between Congress and the president. FDR also loses a lot of support in 1937 because what he tried to do is balance the federal budget and stop deficit spending, which caused another recession to hit. And so basically all the gains that America had made in the 4 years since he had been elected get wiped away in this recession during 1937, 1938. And so he becomes much less popular. Republicans start to gain strength in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And so you also start to have, especially in 1938, Hitler starts really agitating sort of international conflicts in Europe. And so we'll sort of get to that. There's just the New Deal really sort of, we'll talk about this, is that, let's look through this graph. So basically my point to make to you, and you'll hear this a couple times, is the New Deal doesn't end the Great Depression. So for all of these changes, all of this legislation, all these attempts to sort of remedy the problem, it's World War II that really is what is the main cause of the sort of end of the Great Depression in America. And what this and we'll kind of pick up here from where we left off next week, but we're getting to about an hour here, and I want to kind of wrap up. Um, the New Deal is very controversial, and FDR is a very controversial president. There's a lot of people that criticize it. There's a lot of people that support it, mostly based on like, well, are you Republican or are you Democrat? Most of the criticism of the New Deal comes from Republicans who don't believe that like the government should. It's not the government's, especially the national governments, now state governments. You get sort of mixed results in this, but it's not the national government's job to, um, maybe not the government's job at all, to help um, and create these safety nets for people. They also kind of just point at it's like you can't argue with this fact. Like the New Deal didn't cure the Depression, and certainly it gave a lot of relief to Americans during this time period. Um, but it never sort of fully answered the Depression, and unemployment during this period never went below 16%. People are going to be very critical of the New Deal and FDR because under FDR and during this New Deal period, government bureaucracy is going to grow far too much for them. They're going to say that like the national government became way too strong and took away all this power from the states. You're going to talk about doubling the national debt and how like we went way too far into debt and how that's bad for America. You could talk about the United States at this. The New Deal is going to sort of create a welfare state in America where too many people become dependent on the government. They could talk about the New Deal programs coming awfully close to being socialistic and socialism, and how like also like during these New Deal programs, FDR becomes far too powerful. So there's a lot of ways you can criticize the New Deal. There's also a lot of ways that you like can say the New Deal was a really important thing because if and again like this is a very sort of partisan thing is and I'm gonna kind of try to leave my thoughts out of it, but it's really reasonable to argue that the New Deal and these programs were somewhat of a failure to an extent and created a lot of problems that and didn't solve enough problems. But you could also say on the flip side is like the New Deal is a really positive thing, and I think like some of these things are people that would argue that it was a good change for America would use this as evidence. They would say that the New Deal is going to save American capitalism. There's no revolutions that occur, as like you see with like the political revolution of the Nazis in Germany, sort of during the worst times of the Great Depression. You could talk about the New Deal and FDR restoring people's faith in government as a sort of powerful tool for good that they had sort of lost in the early stages of the Great Depression. You could talk about how like the New Deal and the New Deal programs relieved sort of the worst of the crisis, like that, like at a very basic way. Even if it didn't do everything it was supposed to and didn't do everything that it was that FDR had wanted to do, it did still like alleviate a lot of suffering. It establishes that the government had a responsibility to its people, so it sort of ends laissez-faire government where the government sort of has like a hands-off approach to its population. And you could see like a bunch of like New Deal programs are still important today. You talk about Social Security, you talk about labor laws, talk about the Wagner Act, talk about TVA, FDIC, minimum wage, maximum work hours, all that kind of stuff. More equal distribution of income and wealth, and then like I think like the last part is like some people argue that like FDR really wasn't like this extremist, that in fact like he really was more in the middle than what people on either side want to acknowledge. And so it's sort of all in all, I would come back to these two things at some point. You're on Tuesday. You're gonna write a DBQ about to what extent what can like the New Deal programs and be considered a success. So I think that it's just keep these two sort of slides in the back of your mind, and I'll include this PowerPoint in your email so you have it.